When you stop chasing the avoidant, everything changes. Most people think the problem is communication. They think if they say the perfect words, send the perfect text, become more understanding, more patient, more loving, eventually the avoidant will finally open up. That is not usually what happens. What actually happens is this. The more you chase an avoidant, the more pressure they feel. And the more pressure they feel, the more distance they create. Not because they hate you, not because you are worthless, but because closeness activates discomfort inside them. You have to understand something important about avoidant behavior. Avoidants are often highly sensitive to emotional dependency. The moment a relationship starts requiring emotional vulnerability, consistency, or accountability, their nervous system interprets it as loss of freedom. And most people completely misread this. When the avoidant pulls away, the anxious person usually moves closer. They text more, call me, explain more, overanalyze more. They try to prove loyalty. They try to earn reassurance. But psychologically, that pursuit creates a dangerous dynamic. The avoidant subconsciously starts feeling emotionally responsible for your stability. That pressure creates resistance, and resistance kills attraction. This is why chasing almost never works. Now here is where everything changes. The moment you stop chasing, the emotional system between both people shifts completely. Suddenly, the avoidant is no longer reacting to pressure. They are reacting to absence. And absence is psychologically powerful. Human beings are designed to notice emotional contrast. When someone who constantly pursued us suddenly becomes calm, grounded, focused, and emotionally self-contained, the brain immediately pays attention. Because now the avoidant has space to feel something they could not feel before. Curiosity. This is the part most people misunderstand. Stopping the chase is not a manipulation tactic. If you stop chasing only to force someone back, you are still emotionally dependent. You are still orbiting around their approval. Real detachment is different. Real detachment says, I care about you, but I will not abandon myself to keep you. That energy changes everything. You stop monitoring their mood every hour. You stop checking if they viewed your story. You stop building your emotional stability around their inconsistency. And psychologically, something fascinating happens when you do this. Your nervous system becomes regulated again. Most people in these dynamics live in survival mode without realizing it. Their body becomes addicted to uncertainty. They confuse emotional intensity with love. They start craving validation from the very person withholding it. That creates trauma bonding patterns. You begin chasing tiny moments of affection because inconsistency strengthens emotional addiction. Intermittent reinforcement is one of the strongest conditioning mechanisms in human psychology. Casinos use it. Social media uses it. Toxic relationships use it too. The avoidant gives you just enough connection to keep hope alive, then disappears again. And the chase continues. Until one day, you stop. Not angrily. Not dramatically. Not to punish them. You simply wake up and realize your life cannot revolve around someone who keeps emotionally evacuating every time closeness appears. That realization is powerful, because now your energy returns to you. You start rebuilding your routines. Your confidence improves. Your attention returns to your goals, health, purpose, and identity. And ironically, this is often the exact moment the avoidant notices you again. Why? Because attraction often grows in space, not pressure. When the avoidant no longer feels hunted emotionally, their defensive system relaxes. They begin wondering why you changed, why you became calmer, why your energy feels different. But this next part is critical. Do not combine. Fuse their return with transformation. Many avoidants come back because distance restored emotional safety for them. That does not automatically mean they healed their patterns. This is why emotional intelligence matters. When they return, do not immediately surrender your boundaries out of relief. Watch behavior, not promises. Watch consistency, not intensity. Anyone can send emotional messages at midnight. Anyone can say they miss you. Anyone can panic when they feel loss. But healthy relationships are built on emotional reliability, not temporary emotion. And this is the deeper lesson most people eventually learn. Stopping the chase was never really about the avoidant. It was about you reclaiming your emotional center. Because the truth is, many people lose themselves trying to be chosen. They overgive, overexplain, oversacrifice, hoping love will finally feel secure. But secure love does not require emotional exhaustion. You should never have to destroy your peace to maintain someone's attention. The strongest thing you can do psychologically is remain connected to yourself while interacting with others. The moment you abandon yourself to keep someone else, anxiety takes control. And avoidance can sense that anxiety immediately. Confidence is emotionally attractive because it communicates stability. Neediness communicates fear of loss. And fear changes behavior. It makes people tolerate disrespect, inconsistency, mixed signals, and emotional confusion. But once you stop chasing, your standards rise. You stop asking, "How do I make them stay?" And you start asking, "Does this relationship actually bring peace, trust, and emotional safety into my life?" That question changes your future. Because emotionally mature people are not attracted to chaos forever. Eventually, they become exhausted by instability and start valuing calmness, honesty, and consistency. And that is the true transformation. Not getting the avoidant back. Getting yours. Elf back. Avoidant people often confuse closeness with pressure, and that is why intimacy can trigger withdrawal instead of connection. To understand this behavior, you have to understand that avoidant attachment is usually not about a lack of feelings. In many cases, avoidants feel emotions very deeply, but they learned early in life that depending on others was unsafe, overwhelming, or emotionally risky. Because of this, they develop psychological defense mechanisms designed to protect their independence and emotional control. At the beginning of relationships, avoidants can appear highly interested, charming, attentive, and emotionally available. Early stages feel exciting because there is still emotional distance, mystery, and freedom. Nothing feels too demanding yet. But as emotional intimacy increases, something shifts internally. The relationship starts becoming real, and with that reality comes vulnerability, expectations, accountability, and emotional exposure. For the avoidant nervous system, this can feel threatening rather than comforting. Most people assume intimacy creates safety for everyone. For avoidants, intimacy can create anxiety. The closer someone gets, the more emotionally visible they feel. They begin worrying about losing freedom, disappointing the other person, becoming emotionally trapped, or being expected to meet emotional needs they do not fully understand themselves. Instead of moving closer during emotional connection, they instinctively create distance to reduce internal discomfort. This is why avoidants often pull away right after moments of closeness. After deep conversations, affection, commitment, or emotional vulnerability, they may suddenly become cold, distracted, or distant. To the other person, this behavior feels confusing and painful because the connection seemed genuine just moments earlier. But psychologically, the avoidant is trying to regulate emotional overwhelm. Distance becomes their coping mechanism. Another important factor is that avoidants highly value self-reliance. Many of them unconsciously believe needing someone is a weakness. As soon as they notice themselves becoming emotionally attached, fear activates inside them. They may begin focusing on flaws in the relationship, questioning compatibility, or convincing themselves something feels off. This process is called deactivation. It allows them to emotionally disconnect before vulnerability becomes too intense. The tragedy is that many avoidants genuinely want love and connection. However, the deeper the intimacy grows, the more their internal defense systems activate. They may care deeply for someone while simultaneously feeling suffocated by emotional closeness. This creates the confusing push and pull dynamic many people experience with avoidance. One moment they seem fully invested, and the next moment they disappear emotionally. Social conditioning also plays a role. Some avoidants were raised in environments where emotions were dismissed, vulnerability was criticized, or independence was overvalued. As adults, they learn to suppress emotional needs instead of expressing them openly. Over time, emotional distancing became automatic. Rather than communicating fear directly, they withdraw silently. What makes this dynamic even more difficult is that avoidants usually do not see themselves as avoidant. Many believe they simply need space or lose feelings quickly. In reality, their nervous system is reacting to intimacy as if closeness equals danger. Their withdrawal is often more about self-protection than rejection. Understanding this psychology does not mean excusing unhealthy behavior, inconsistency, or emotional neglect. It simply explains why avoidants behave the way they do when relationships become emotionally serious. The more intimacy increases, the more vulnerable they feel, And vulnerability is exactly what their mind has spent years trying to avoid. One of the biggest mistakes people ache in relationships with avoidance, is believing that more effort will create more closeness. When the avoidant starts pulling away, most people react emotionally. They send longer messages, ask for reassurance, try harder to communicate, and attempt to fix the distance as quickly as possible. From their perspective, they are fighting for the relationship, but psychologically, this pursuit often intensifies the exact behavior they are trying to stop. The reason chasing makes things worse is because pursuit and withdrawal feed each other emotionally. The more one person chases, the more pressure the avoidant feels. And the more pressure the avoidant feels, the stronger their instinct becomes to escape, detach, or create space. This creates a cycle where both people unintentionally trigger each other's deepest fears. For the anxious pursuer, distance feels like abandonment. Silence creates panic, uncertainty, and emotional instability. Their nervous system becomes hyper-focused on connecting because they believe emotional closeness will restore safety. This is why they often overtext, over-explain, overanalyze, and seek immediate reassurance. They are trying to reduce emotional anxiety. But the avoidant experiences this very differently. To the avoidant, emotional pursuit can feel overwhelming rather than loving. Every message, emotional conversation, or attempt to work things out may feel like increasing emotional pressure. Instead of feeling closer, they feel emotionally cornered. Their nervous system interprets pursuit as loss of freedom, loss of control, or forced vulnerability. This is where the hidden emotional dynamic becomes dangerous. The anxious person believes, if I care more, they will feel safer. But the avoidant subconsciously thinks, the more they need from me emotionally, the less safe I feel. Both people are trying to protect themselves, but their coping strategies completely collide. Another reason chasing backfires is because it ifts the emotional balance of the relationship. When one person constantly pursues while the other withdraws, attraction often begins to weaken. Human psychology naturally values emotional stability and confidence. But constant chasing communicates emotional dependence, fear of loss, and insecurity. Even if the pursuer has good intentions, the avoidant can begin feeling emotionally responsible for the other person's emotional state. That responsibility creates pressure. Pressure creates resistance. And resistance destroys emotional openness. Ironically, the more desperately someone tries to hold on to the relationship, the more emotionally heavy the relationship begins to feel for the avoidant. Conversations stop feeling natural. Everything starts carrying emotional weight. Even simple interactions feel loaded with expectation. This is why avoidants often say things like, I need space, or you're putting too much pressure on me, even when the other person is simply asking for no. RMAL emotional consistency. There is also a neurological component involved. Chasing activates emotional survival systems in both people. The anxious partner becomes addicted to reassurance and connection, while the avoidant becomes addicted to distance and emotional regulation through separation. The relationship turns into a cycle of temporary relief instead of genuine emotional intimacy. Intermittent reinforcement makes this even stronger. When the avoidant occasionally returns with affection, attention, or vulnerability, the anxious partner experiences emotional reward after emotional deprivation. This strengthens attachment psychologically, making the person chase even harder the next time distance appears. Over time, the relationship becomes emotionally addictive rather than emotionally healthy. What most people fail to realize is that chasing usually pushes the focus away from self-respect and onto emotional survival. Instead of asking whether the relationship is healthy, the why become consumed with keeping the connection alive at any cost. They sacrifice boundaries, peace, and emotional stability trying to prevent abandonment. But emotional pressure rarely creates secure love. In fact, secure connection usually grows when both people feel emotionally free rather than emotionally trapped. The avoidant needs space to process emotions without feeling controlled, while the anxious person needs self-worth that does not depend entirely on external reassurance. Without those two things, the cycle continues endlessly. This is why chasing makes it worse. It transforms love into emotional pursuit, and pursuit often triggers the very withdrawal the pursuer fears most. The moment you stop chasing an avoidant, the entire emotional dynamic begins to change. What once felt like a one-sided emotional struggle suddenly shifts because the energy driving the relationship is no longer the same. Most people do not realize that chasing creates an invisible psychological contract. One person becomes responsible for pursuing connection, while the other becomes responsible for controlling distance. As long as that pattern continues, both people remain locked inside predictable emotional roles. But when the chasing stops, the system becomes disrupted. For the anxious person, this moment often feels terrifying at first. They are used to constantly monitoring the relationship, searching for signs of reassurance, and trying to maintain emotional closeness. Their mind becomes conditioned to believe that effort equals survival. So when they finally stop chasing, there is usually an uncomfortable silence inside them. They feel withdrawal symptoms emotionally because their nervous system was attached not only to the person, but also to the cycle itself. However, something powerful starts happening beneath the surface. The emotional energy that was previously focused outward begins returning inward. Instead of obsessing over messages, mixed signals, or emotional inconsistency, the person slowly reconnects with themselves. Their thoughts become clearer. Their nervous system begins calming down. They regain emotional stability because they are no longer trapped in constant anticipation and uncertainty. Psychologically, this is a major shift in power. Not power in the sense of manipulation or revenge, but power in emotional control. The person who stops chasing is no longer reacting automatically to fear of abandonment. They stop allowing another person's inconsistency to dictate their emotional state. That emotional independence changes the way they think, speak, and behave. At the same time, the avoidant experiences a different psychological reaction. When someone constantly chases them, they become accustomed to emotional pursuit always being available. Even if they pull away repeatedly, they subconsciously expect the other person to return, explain, reassure, or continue fighting for connection. The chase becomes predictable and predictable pursuit often loses emotional impact over time. But when the pursuit suddenly disappears, the avoidant notices the absence immediately. Human psychology is highly sensitive to contrast. We often become more aware of something after it is gone or emotionally unavailable. When the avoidant no longer feels pressure, emotional demands, or constant attention, their defensive system begins relaxing. For the first time, they are no longer reacting to pursuit. Instead, they are left alone with their own thoughts and emotions. This is where curiosity often appears. The avoidant may begin wondering why the other person changed. They may check messages more often, think about the relationship more deeply, or suddenly feel emotional uncertainty themselves. The emotional distance they once controlled now feels different because the dynamic is no longer centered around their withdrawal. This is why avoidants sometimes return after someone stops chasing them. The emotional pressure disappears, which allows space for reflection and emotional processing. But the deeper transformation is not really about whether the avoidant comes back. The real transformation happens inside the person who reclaimed their emotional center. When someone stops chasing, they begin rebuilding self-respect. They stop abandoning their own needs to maintain connection. Their confidence slowly returns because they realize they can survive emotional distance without collapsing emotionally. They start focusing on personal growth, routines, goals, friendships, health, and inner peace instead of constantly managing someone else's inconsistency. That emotional groundedness becomes attractive because it communicates stability rather than desperation. There is also a deeper psychological truth involved. People often value what feels emotionally scarce or difficult to control. When someone endlessly chases, their attention becomes emotionally predictable. But when they become calm, self-focused, and emotionally balanced, they regain mystery and emotional weight. The avoidant now sees them as an independent person instead of a constant source of reassurance seeking. Most importantly, stopping the chase breaks emotional dependency. The relationship no longer controls the person's identity or self-worth. Whether the avoidant stays, leaves, returns, or disappears, the individual begins standing emotionally on their own feet again. That is the true power shift. Not controlling another person, controlling yourself. Many people misunderstand emotional detachment. They think becoming emotionally detached means becoming cold, distant, uncaring, or emotionally unavailable. But true emotional control is very different from emotional numbness. One comes from fear and self-protection, while the other comes from self-respect, stability, and inner strength. When someone has been hurt repeatedly in relationships, Especially in avoidant anxious dynamics, they often reach a breaking point emotionally. They become exhausted from chasing, overthinking, and constantly trying to earn consistency from someone emotionally unavailable. At that point, many people make a dangerous mistake. Instead of learning emotional control, they shut down emotionally altogether. They stop expressing vulnerability. They stop trusting. They pretend not to care. They become emotionally defensive. On the surface, this can look like strength. But psychologically, coldness is often just unresolved pain wearing armor. Real emotional control does not mean you stop feeling emotions. It means your emotions stop controlling your behavior. You still care. You still feel attachment, disappointment, attraction, and sadness. The difference is that you no longer abandon your dignity or emotional stability because of those feelings. That distinction changes everything. An emotionally detached person often disconnects to avoid pain. They suppress emotions because vulnerability feels dangerous. Instead of communicating calmly, they withdraw, ignore, avoid, or emotionally shut people out. Their behavior is driven by fear of emotional exposure. But emotional control comes from a completely different psychological place. A person with emotional control can feel strong emotions without becoming consumed by them. They do not panic every time someone pulls away. They do not immediately react out of insecurity, desperation, or fear of abandonment. They pause. They think clearly. They protect their peace without needing to punish anyone emotionally. This is where self-respect becomes important. Self-respect means understanding that your emotional needs matter too. It means you no longer beg for consistency, attention, or reassurance from someone unwilling to give it freely. You stop trying to force emotional connection where mutual effort does not exist. And surprisingly, this calm emotional groundedness is far more powerful than emotional coldness. Coldness often creates emotional walls. Ional control creates emotional boundaries. There is a major difference between the two. Walls say, "No one gets close to me again." Boundaries say, "You can get close to me, but not at the cost of my peace." Emotionally mature people do not need to become cruel to protect themselves. They simply stop tolerating behaviors that destroy their emotional health. They learn how to stay calm without becoming emotionally unavailable themselves. This is difficult because many people confuse reaction with strength. They think ignoring someone, acting emotionless, or becoming distant gives them control. In reality, reactive coldness often reveals unresolved emotional pain. If your behavior is still designed to punish, provoke, or gain validation, then the other person still controls your emotional state. True emotional control feels different internally. There is less urgency, less panic, less obsession. You stop monitoring every message and every mood change. You no longer feel the need to force outcomes. You accept reality instead of fighting desperately against it. That acceptance creates emotional freedom. This also changes the way others perceive you psychologically. When someone becomes emotionally grounded, they project stability rather than emotional chaos. Their energy feels calmer, more confident, and more secure because they are no longer operating from emotional survival mode. Ironically, people often become more attractive when they stop trying to control how others feel about them. Why? Because emotional confidence signals abundance instead of fear. It communicates that your identity is not dependent on external validation. You enjoy connection, but you do not emotionally collapse without it. That is the heart of self-respect. Self-respect is not arrogance. It is the quiet decision to stop betraying yourself for temporary emotional comfort. It is understanding that love should not require emotional self-destruction. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: emotional control does not harden your heart. It strengthens your mind while allowing your heart to remain open wisely. You still love deeply, but you no longer lose yourself in the process. One of the most confusing experiences people have with avoidance is watching them disappear emotionally, only to suddenly reappear weeks or even months later. After creating distance, becoming cold, or acting emotionally unavailable, the avoidant unexpectedly reaches out again with curiosity, affection, or renewed interest. To the person who was left confused and hurt, this behavior can feel emotionally shocking. They often wonder, why now? The answer lies in understanding how avoidants process intimacy, emotional pressure, and safety differently from most people. Avoidants are highly sensitive to emotional intensity. When relationships become emotionally close, their nervous system can interpret that closeness as pressure instead of comfort. During moments of increasing intimacy, why they may feel overwhelmed by expectations, vulnerability, emotional dependency, or fear of losing their independence. Even when they genuinely care about someone, their instinct is often to create distance to regain emotional control. This is why avoidants frequently pull away during emotionally significant moments. The relationship may have been healthy, loving, or deeply connected, but their internal discomfort becomes stronger than their ability to stay emotionally present. Instead of communicating their fears openly, they withdraw. Distance becomes their emotional coping mechanism. However, something important happens after separation. Once emotional pressure disappears, the avoidant nervous system begins calming down. They no longer feel overwhelmed by constant emotional demands, intense conversations, or perceived expectations. The relationship stops feeling emotionally heavy, which creates psychological relief. Ironically, it is often only after this relief appears that the avoidant finally has enough emotional space to process their feelings clearly. This delayed emotional processing is a major reason avoidants suddenly reappear. While the anxious person processes pain immediately, the avoidant often suppresses emotions during the relationship itself. Their focus is survival, distance, and emotional regulation. But after enough time passes, suppressed emotions slowly rise back to the surface. Memories become softer. The positive parts of the relationship become easier to feel. Emotional curiosity returns because the fear response is no longer dominating their nervous system. Human psychology also plays a role here. People often feel attraction more strongly when they have emotional space rather than emotional pressure. When someone constantly chases an avoidant, the avoidant feels responsible for managing the other person's emotional needs. That responsibility can feel suffocating to them. But when the chasing stops completely, the emotional atmosphere, fear changes. Now the avoidant experiences absence instead of pursuit. Absence creates contrast. Suddenly, the person who once provided constant attention, reassurance, or emotional energy is no longer emotionally available in the same way. This often activates curiosity, reflection, and even longing. The avoidant may begin wondering if they lost someone valuable. They may revisit old memories, check social media, or reach out unexpectedly just to reconnect emotionally. But it is important to understand that reappearing does not always mean emotional growth occurred. Sometimes avoidants return because they finally feel emotionally safe again, not because they fully healed their underlying patterns. Emotional safety for avoidants often increases when they believe there is less pressure, less expectation, and less emotional intensity. In other words, distance can temporarily restore attraction because it removes the fear that originally triggered withdrawal. This creates the classy, see push and pull cycle many people experience. The avoidant returns once enough space exists, but if emotional closeness becomes intense again too quickly, the same fears can reactivate. Without self-awareness and emotional growth, the pattern often repeats itself. Another reason avoidants reappear is because many genuinely do care deeply, even when their behavior suggests otherwise. Their problem is usually not lack of emotion but difficulty tolerating vulnerability consistently. They miss connection, affection, and familiarity once emotional overwhelm fades. But because they struggle expressing emotional needs directly, their return can feel confusing, inconsistent, or unpredictable. This is why emotional intelligence matters so much when dealing with avoidance. People often mistake reappearance for permanent transformation. They become hopeful immediately and ignore whether actual behavioral change has occurred. But healthy relationships require more than temporary longing or emotional nostalgia. They require consistency, communication, emotional accountability, and willingness to stay emotionally present even when intimacy feels uncomfortable. Understanding delayed attraction helps explain why avoidants suddenly reappear, but it also reveals something deeper. Their return is often driven by emotional safety, reduced pressure, and space to feel emotions at their own pace. The challenge is learning the difference between someone missing your presence and someone truly becoming capable of healthy emotional connection. The biggest transformation that happens when you stop chasing an avoidant is not about getting them back. It is about getting yourself back. Most people enter these relationships believing they are fighting for love, but over time they slowly begin losing pieces of their identity without realizing it. Their emotional energy becomes consumed by uncertainty. mixed signals, emotional highs and lows, and constant attempts to maintain connection. Little by little, their self-worth becomes tied to another person's attention and consistency. This is where emotional exhaustion begins. When someone spends months chasing reassurance, trying to decode behavior, or constantly worrying about where they stand emotionally, their nervous system remains in a constant state of tension. They wake up thinking about the relationship. They check messages obsessively. Their mood rises and falls based on another person's responses. Eventually, life stops revolving around personal growth and starts revolving around emotional survival. But the moment the chase ends, something powerful begins to happen internally. At first, stopping the chase feels uncomfortable because the mind has become addicted to emotional pursuit. There is silence where obsession once existed. There is emptiness where emotional chaos once lived. Many people mistake this temporary emptiness for loneliness, but psychologically it is actually the nervous system beginning to detox from ROM, emotional dependency. For the first time in a long time, the person is no longer pouring all their energy into controlling outcomes they cannot control. And slowly, their attention returns to themselves. This is where confidence begins rebuilding. True confidence does not come from forcing someone to stay. It comes from realizing you can survive without constantly seeking validation from people who are emotionally inconsistent. Every time someone chooses self-respect over emotional desperation, their identity becomes stronger. They stop seeing themselves as someone fighting to be chosen and start recognizing their own value independently. That internal shift changes the way they carry themselves emotionally. They become calmer, more grounded, less reactive. Instead of chasing reassurance, they begin creating stability within themselves. Their focus moves toward personal goals, routines, health, friendships, purpose, and emotional healing. The relationship no longer dominates every thought because their life begins expanding again beyond emotional uncertainty. This is the beginning of inner peace. Inner peace is not the absence of emotion. It is the absence of emotional chaos controlling your identity. When someone stops chasing, they stop living in constant anticipation of another person's moods, disappearances, or mixed signals. Their nervous system finally gets a chance to rest. That peace feels unfamiliar at first because many people unconsciously become addicted to emotional intensity. They mistake anxiety for passion and unpredictability for love. But once emotional clarity returns, they begin realizing how draining the constant pursuit truly was. Another important transformation happens psychologically. Boundaries become stronger. People who constantly chase often tolerate behavior they would normally never accept. Fear of losing the relationship causes them to ignore disrespect, inconsistency, lack of communication, and emotional neglect. But once they reconnect with their self-worth, their standards rise naturally. They stop begging for the bare minimum. They stop romanticizing emotional unavailability. They begin choosing relationships that feel safe instead of relationships that feel emotionally addictive. This also changes how others perceive them. Confidence built through self-respect creates emotional magnetism, not because they are pretending not to care, but because they genuinely stop needing external validation to feel complete. Their energy becomes more peaceful and emotionally stable. They no longer appear desperate for approval because their happiness is no longer dependent on someone else's attention. Ironically, this is often when avoidants notice the biggest change. The person who once chased endlessly now feels emotionally independent. There is less pressure, less emotional panic, and more calm confidence. But by this point, something important has already shifted internally. The person no longer needs the relationship to feel whole. And that is the real transformation. Not becoming colder, not becoming emotionally unavailable, but becoming emotionally stronger. Because true healing is not about learning how to make someone stay. It is learning how to stay connected to yourself no matter who leaves. Once someone reaches that point, relationships stop defining their worth. They can love deeply without abandoning their peace, care without losing their identity, and walk away from emotional instability without feeling destroyed by it. That is what rebuilding yourself truly looks like.